Today is Saturday, 13th July, and tomorrow, 14th July, I will be taking the day off in connection with certain important events relating to my children. So tomorrow I will not be making a program, for which apologies, but I will be back on Monday. Now, of course, there is always the possibility that something major will happen over the course of the next 24 hours, and I will not be able to cover it because I have not obviously done a program about it tomorrow. Well, that is unfortunately an occupational hazard if one is trying to stay on top of the international news, and tomorrow I'm afraid I'm going to have to accept the possibility that that might happen. It's something I have promised my family, that we'll be taking the day off tomorrow. It's an important day for my children, and I must obviously honour that promise. Normal business on Monday. I will be back doing programs then. So, without further ado, let's proceed to today's program, to the program today. And yesterday I discussed at some length the continued political ferment in the United States, the intense uncertainty about President Biden's long-term position, and the reaction, the certain reaction of the rest of the world. They'll be asking what exactly is going on in the United States, and they will have already concluded to a great extent that President Biden is no longer in full control of the government, and that the situation politically in the United States is in crisis, and that the United States is drifting without effective leadership. Well, one government has acted immediately in response to these events, and that, interestingly enough, is the Russian government. And they did so in the form of a call from their defense minister, Andrei Belousov, to the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin. Now, it is actually unusual for the Russians to initiate these calls. Every so often, the United States does. It calls the Russian Defense Ministry to speak to the Russian Defense Minister. So it is unusual when the Russians initiate a call. I suspect the reason they did that, actually, is connected with the events of the NATO summit meeting. We know that there were significant discussions over the course of the NATO summit meeting initiated by the Ukrainians, for Ukraine to be granted permission to launch deep strikes into Russia using ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. For the moment, both the United States and Britain have rejected those proposals, observing Russian red lines. There's also been an announcement by the United States that the United States from 2026 is planning to install air defense, intermediate nuclear weapons in Germany. These will be Tomahawk cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, which are still under development in the United States, and which, to say it simply, are unlikely to be ready for deployment by 2026, and more of the Aegis onshore systems, which appear to be intended to provide air defense for these facilities in the United States. And this obviously concerns the Russians. President Putin had a meeting, chaired a meeting recently of his Security Council. He has authorized the development of intermediate nuclear force weapons. On the Russian side, I've discussed that in a recent program. Almost certainly the key system will be the Urozhaine ballistic missile, which is a development, by the way, of the YARS intercontinental road mobile intercontinental ballistic missile, though it is likely that the Rubej will use hypersonic glide vehicle warheads. And in addition, it's likely that the Russians will now move ahead to develop a land-based version of the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile, which for the moment is confined to Russian Navy warships. But with the INF Treaty gone, with the United States now taking the first steps to deploy intermediate nuclear missiles to Germany, the Russians will start to take countermeasures, and they will no doubt feel free to develop and place in service hypersonic versions of the Zircon missile that can be launched from land as well as from the sea. And this, I would have thought, would be a fairly simple adaptation. I suspect the Russians have probably already been working on it for some time. It's likely that we will see a land-based Zircon missile appear in service with the Russian military as soon as next year. Just saying. Apparently Germany has said that these weapon systems are needed for the security and stability of the military situation in Europe. A very, very different attitude, by the way, than that which I suspect most German people feel, and of course a radically different attitude from the one that the most Germans had when the United States last stationed intermediate nuclear force weapons in Germany in the late 1970s and 1980s. And of course, then the Green Party in those days, led by Patrick Kelly and General Bastian, as I very well remember, were at the forefront of opposing these American deployments of intermediate nuclear force weapons in Germany. Whereas today, the Green Party, led by Robert Habeck and Annalena Baerbock, are at the forefront of supporting these deployments as members of the existing government. I'm not going to dwell on these paradoxes further, at least not in this program. Anyway, it is likely that in calling Lloyd Austin, Belousov wanted to discuss these two issues, both the threats or calls from the Ukrainians to launch deep strikes into Russia using ATACMS and Storm Shadows, and also he probably will have wanted to discuss the American plans for deployments of intermediate nuclear force weapons in Germany. The Russian summary of the call is very brief, and this is what it says. At the initiative of the Russian Federation, a telephone call was held between Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Andrei Belousov, and United States Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. The issue of preventing security threats and reducing the risk of possible escalation was discussed. And those words, preventing security threats and reducing the risk of possible escalation, to my mind, covers precisely the two topics that I've been talking about. The ideas floated for deep strikes by ATACMS and Storm Shadows missiles, supposedly launched by the Ukrainians into Russia, and the American plan to deploy intermediate nuclear forces in Germany. And Belousov will have repeated Russian warnings about the first reminding the United States that such strikes deep inside Russia will undoubtedly provoke Russian retaliation, and also undoubtedly Belousov will have warned Lloyd Austin that in relation to American deployments of missiles in Germany, the Russians are going to take mirror responses. And, well, I've discussed the Zircons, the land-based Zircons, and the Rubezh missiles, but it's almost certain that the Russians are also going to start deploying more of the new strategic systems that they have been developing. Systems like the Status 6 or Poseidon, if we would prefer, nuclear-powered drone with a multi-megaton thermonuclear warhead, allegedly. This is apparently now on the brink of entering service, the first carrier submarine for this terrifying weapon, which I've discussed in programs on this channel before. The first of these submarines, the Belgorod, is now in service, and more submarines, which are intended as carriers for this weapon, are coming. And of course, the Russians apparently, allegedly, are close to completing the rather difficult testing program for the Burevestnik nuclear-powered intercontinental cruise missile that has been under development in Russia for some time. Now, bear in mind that one of the fundamental differences between the situation today in terms of intermediate nuclear forces and the situation in the late 1970s and late 1970s and early 1980s was that the Russians at that time were constrained in what they could do in response to American deployments of intermediate nuclear weapons in Germany by the fact that they had previously, via treaties or attempted treaties, agreed to strategic arms limitation provisions. So they couldn't deploy more strategic weapons to counter the intermediate weapons that the Americans had because of these restrictions that they had negotiated with the Americans and placed on themselves. Now, as a result of the collapse of all of the arms limitation treaties, those constraints, to all intents and purposes, are falling away. So it is going to be much easier for the Russians to deploy weapons like the Burevestnik and the Poseidon to counter American deployments in Germany than it was in the 1980s. Besides, by definition, we are in a completely different technological universe. The gains that the United States will achieve by these forward deployments of weapons into Germany are not remotely comparable to what they were in the 1980s. In the 1980s, Pershing II missiles could target positions in Russia within exceptionally short time periods and well within making it very difficult for the Russians to detect and counter them. And the Russians at that time did not have the enormously complex, massive, layered anti-missile defense system, which to a great extent they do today. So things have changed. I myself, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, do not see that the United States or the Pentagon gains very much by these deployments, but it is something that the Pentagon has been hankering to do ever since the late 1950s. They did it for a certain period of time in the late 1950s and early 1960s when they deployed Jupiter missiles to Italy and Turkey and other places, something which the Russians countered in part by stationing missiles in Cuba, and which was an important and rarely discussed aspect of what became the Cuban Missile Crisis, just saying. But anyway, the US had to withdraw those systems following an agreement that was negotiated over the course of the Cuban Missile Crisis by President Kennedy and the then Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. And then, of course, the United States managed to install intermediate nuclear weapons, again within range of Russian territory, including Moscow, in the 1980s, against the backdrop of massive protests in Europe. But again, it had to withdraw them after Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated and agreed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And, well, this is the third time that the Pentagon is doing this. Only, as I said, the strategic balance has changed. Technology has changed. And I don't think that these forward deployments of weapons confer the kind of advantage that they did in the 1960s and 1980s. But anyway, putting aside all of this, I suspect that there was a third reason why the Russians wanted to speak to the Americans at this time, and that does relate to the problems that President Biden is facing in the United States. The Russians, in initiating this call and in discussing these matters with Lloyd Austin, were, I am sure, undoubtedly testing the Americans to see how strong and coherent the American response would be. Lloyd Austin, of course, has had problems of his own. He has recently been seriously ill and has had surgery. And the Russians might see him, because of these problems, as also in a weaker position than he might be. And beyond that, they are aware that the president himself is in serious problems, putting aside his health issues or possible health issues. He's also got a political crisis swirling around him, and the Russians will have wanted to test that. Over the next few weeks, more and more governments around the world, friendly and hostile towards the United States, are going to do the same thing. We're going to have calls to the White House from all sorts of leaders from around the world, all of them probably asking to speak to the president or to his top advisors. Obviously, always they will have serious topics and issues that they want to talk about, but also and always they will be wanting to test the weather in Washington to see how functional the US administration actually is at this time. And to reiterate again, some governments will be concerned because they have friendly relations with the United States and want the United States to be strong on their behalf. Other governments which are unfriendly to the United States will also be concerned because from their point of view, a US that is hostile is a problem when it is strongly led, but a US which is hostile but is not led at all is far more dangerous altogether. And there are going to be some governments and some forces which are going to sense an opportunity. And it's not impossible that over the next few months, things, far from being quiet in the international sphere, are going to start heating up. Anyway, an interesting conversation between Belousov and Austin. And the most important fact about it, the thing that is unusual about it, is, as I said, that it was the Russians who initiated it. Now, as for the president's own position, I'm not going to add much to what I said in my program yesterday, except that I have seen this rather dramatic article in the Financial Times. And its title says that the Democrats in disarray over Biden. And then there's a quote from a senior Democrat: "We are totally screwed." That's the title. That is the actual title in the Financial Times. Democrats in disarray over Biden. Quote, "We are totally screwed." And the subtitle is, "After the president's disastrous debate performance, the party has been plunged into a crisis over whether to force him out." Which, of course, doesn't resolve the problem of how exactly to force him out if he refuses to go, which, for the moment, he is continuing to do. Well, I'm not going to discuss this further in this program today. I discussed it exhaustively yesterday. As I said, it is for the Democrats to sort out their own problems. The consensus from this article is that the consensus apparently amongst Democrats from this article is that it seems that they no longer believe that they're going to be able to win the election in November, regardless of what happens. There is, for example, and this is, I'm taking it from the Financial Times article, this quote from a person close to the White House. We don't know who this is. "Every single Democrat that I've talked to, and I've talked to about 1,000 in the past week," which is, by the way, I suspect impossible, but anyway, never mind. This person, whoever they are, have talked to lots of them. Let's be a little bit more realistic. Anyway, and I've talked to 1,000 in the past week. Every single one thinks the same thing, which is we're totally screwed. There's no way Biden can win this election, and there's no way he can prosecute the case against Trump. If it turned into a referendum on Biden, we were always going to lose, and that's what's happening. And we also read other dramatic things. Another one, someone else says, "I feel like I'm screaming into the void. We are willingly walking into a bear den. We have a team in the presidential space here that has looked at all the options and that decided that murder-suicide is the way to go." And it's pretty terrifying. Murder-suicide? What does that mean exactly? I'm not even going to try and speculate as to the meaning of all of this. But suffice to say that if you wanted proof that the Democratic Party is in panic and is freaking out, well, you have it in all of these lovely quotes that are appearing in this Financial Times article. You don't have to go to me. I can, as I said, I'm always good at smelling panic when it exists, but on this occasion, I hardly have to do even that, because the Financial Times is laying it all out for us in this article. Now, one particular government must be more concerned than any other, and that is, of course, the government of President Zelensky. Now, Zelensky, one of the most fascinating moments, vignettes, if you like, of the last couple of days, was studying Zelensky's face when Biden introduced him as President Putin. But seriously, even though the relationship between Biden and Zelensky is, by nearly every account, far from friendly, it is nonetheless true to say that Biden has been the single most important and most committed ally that the Ukrainians have in the West. Without the kind of support, unstinting support that they've had from Biden and from the current administration, well, this war would have ended long ago in a Russian victory and a Ukrainian defeat. Now, it must be said, there are plenty of other people in the United States, plenty of other people in the Democratic Party, who, if they were president, would want to prosecute the war with the same kind of vigor that President Biden has done. And the same is true of the Republican Party. There are any number of Republicans who are as fervidly supportive and hawkish on this topic of the war in Ukraine as any Democrat, and as is the president himself. Indeed, if you go to certain Republican magazines and news outlets, like, for example, the Mitch McConnell oriented, neocon heavy National Review, their criticism of the president, of President Biden, is that he has not been hardline enough. He's not been as supportive of Ukraine as he needed to be, at least in their estimation. But of course, it is not Republicans from this wing of the party that Zelensky might have to contend with in January of next year. It is the Republican nominee is Donald Trump, is former President Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has been much more ambivalent, far less enthusiastic about Ukraine than Biden has been. Over the course of that same television debate that we're hearing so much about, Trump made the rather acid comment that Zelensky is the greatest salesman on planet Earth. Every time he comes to the United States, he walks away with $60 billion. Now, Zelensky is probably not especially familiar with the labyrinth that is American domestic politics. I am not, by the way. I find it very difficult to understand or guess how the political events in the United States are going to shape out. But he knows that in Biden, he's had a staunch ally, even if it's an ally that he doesn't always get on with. And he also knows that Donald Trump has been saying these things about him. He also knows that Donald Trump and Viktor Orban, who has been on a peace mission, which for Zelensky is deeply unwelcome, have just had a meeting with each other. All of this is going to make Zelensky very nervous, and it is going to make other officials in Zelensky's government in Kiev also extremely nervous. There is very little that they can do, the Ukrainians can do, at this point to influence the political situation in the United States. It would be, I think, extremely unwise of them, for example, to intervene directly into the debates within the Democratic Party about whether Biden stays or goes. But they will probably say to themselves that the prospect of Trump is an alarming one, and that what they need to do is to nail the United States down into a cast-iron commitment to Ukraine between now and January when the next president is inaugurated, and whilst they are confident that they will have an administration that is sympathetic to themselves. And that, to my mind, points to the Ukrainians trying in some way over the next few weeks and months some sort of major escalation which will lead to the United States recommitting to support for Ukraine. Now, I'm not going to speculate as to what that escalation is going to be, but I think it is something that everyone needs to keep in mind. Desperate people tend to do desperate things. It seems to me that for Ukraine, the situation now is becoming extremely desperate, and it's highly likely, very probable, that something very big and very bad is going to happen over the next few weeks and months as time on the clock starts to run out. Well, anyway, let's actually now turn to the situation on the front lines, because again, we've had more news about what is happening on the battle lines, and all of it continues to point to a very terrible situation for Ukraine. Firstly, the Russian Defense Ministry did what it often does. It provided its summary of the situation over the previous week. It gave the usual list of Ukrainian casualties in the various sectors of the line of contact. It discussed how many items of Ukrainian military equipment had been destroyed. It discussed how more ATACMS missiles had been destroyed as well. We are still getting occasional launches by Ukraine of ATACMS missiles at Russian targets, though it's some time now since I've heard of these ATACMS missiles penetrating the Russian air defenses and inflicting any significant damage on the Russian military. Putting that aside, the single most important number, however, remains what the Russians say about the casualties that Ukraine is suffering. And if you add it all up, according to the Russians, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, and again, I stress, these are Russian figures, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, Ukraine lost over 14,000 men, dead and wounded, in the 7 days leading up to Friday of last week. 14,000 men, 2,000 a day, dead and wounded. That tells us how intense the fighting has now become, and if this level of losses is true, which it may be, then, as I've said already, there is no way that the Ukrainians can keep up with this level of losses. They can recruit more men, they can conduct more mobilizations, but they will never be able to replace the kind of losses that they're suffering, losses on this sort of scale. Now, again, I want to stress, I have no way of externally corroborating these Russian figures. Some time ago, the former Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that the Russians obtained their information from radio intercepts that the Ukrainians themselves are providing. One can be as cynical about these Russian estimates as one chooses, but the Ukrainians themselves have for some time now been admitting to a manpower crisis, and that tends, in my opinion, to support these numbers that the Russians are giving us. Now, that probably is the single most important fact about the fighting last week. The Russians have made significant military gains. They have captured significant positions along the contact line. They're continuing to advance all along the contact line. But putting aside these territorial gains, this remains first and foremost an attrition war, a war of attrition, by Russian choice, I might add, and the Russians are achieving ever more significant attrition over the Ukrainians. So, as I said, it's the single most important metric up to this time. That doesn't, of course, mean that the Russians are not making territorial gains. I understand that this morning, though I haven't actually seen the report yet, but I understand that there is a claim that the Russian Defense Ministry says, I want to stress I haven't seen this report, I've heard about this. It's not yet up on the English language version of their Telegram channel. But I understand that the Russian Defense Ministry is now saying that the village of Urozhaine in the Vremivka salient area has now been captured by the Russians. That means that those two villages that the Ukrainian Marines fought for with such bitterness and difficulty over the course of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive, Staromayorsk and Urozhaine, these two villages in the Vremivka salient area, which, when the Ukrainians claimed that they had captured them, I remember the way it was represented in the media in the West at that time as big news. Those two villages have reverted to Russian control. And it's likely that the Russians are not going to stop with these two villages. They will probably advance elsewhere in the Vremivka salient area, recapturing the various other villages that they lost to the Ukrainians in this area during the fighting in the summer of last year. So it looks like in this sector, as in the Zaporozhye sector near Rabotino, the Russians have in effect erased Ukrainian gains during the summer offensive, which were paltry to say the least. But that's not the most important news, obviously. The most important news comes from other areas on the battlefronts. Now, we have film and photographic evidence in the Kupiansk area that the Russians have now indeed entered and are fighting for and control, at the very least, the southern half of the village of Makeyevka on the Zherebets River. More likely than not, by this time, they are in control of the entire village. It's a small place. It's likely that, having captured part of it, they have by now captured the rest of it. That's a guess. It may be wrong. Makeyevka is north of Terny, that village where the Russians were moving towards earlier this year. Many will remember that some weeks ago there was a Ukrainian mass FPV drone strike against a Russian armored column moving towards Terny. There were lots of enthusiastic or alarmed claims that the Russians had suffered a terrible disaster in the area of Terny. I myself thought those claims were inflated or over-exaggerated. Whatever the Ukrainians achieved by that attack, or rather that counterattack near Terny, with Makeyevka about to fall, or perhaps having already fallen, the days of Terni are indeed numbered. It could be that the Russians, having attempted to capture Terni, decided and been pushed back, decided that attacking Terni from the east was too difficult, and that they refocused their efforts further north to capture Makeyevka, which opens the way to capture Terni too. And of course, if they do capture Terni and do clear all the villages on the Zherebets River, which apparently would be undefendable if the Russians took both Makeyevka and Terni, well, the Russians are then well within striking distance of the town of Liman, further west across the Zherebets River. And of course, Liman was the single most important place in some respects that the Ukrainians recaptured during their successful 2022 Kharkiv offensive, because Liman is very much one of the outer towns that make up the Slavyansk conurbation, and the Slavyansk conurbation is itself a part of the bigger Slavyansk Kramatorsk conurbation, which is the last big urban area in Donbass that the Ukrainians still control, and which is also, incidentally, the last big urban area in Donbass east of the Dnieper. Just saying. So if the Russians cross the Zherebets River and are able to recapture Liman, then once again they are within striking distance of Slavyansk. And of course, if the Russians also capture Makeyevka, or rather regain control of Makeyevka, because I believe that for a period of time in 2022 they also controlled it. But if they regain control of Makeyevka, it becomes much easier for the Russians to push north up the Zherebets and Oskol rivers. They're making significant progress in capturing other villages to the east of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers further north, and that will put the Ukrainian defenses in Kupiansk in a very critical position. And of course, if the Russians are able to recapture Kupiansk, they will not only have recaptured the town, which became for a time in the summer of 2022 the administrative center of Russian-controlled Kharkiv region, but it will also put the Russians in a position, if they've captured Kupiansk, where they can move further westwards and recapture places like Izium and Balakleya, also positioning themselves to the north of Slavyansk. So this advance by the Russians into Makeyevka is big news. And it is confirmed. There are, as I said, photographic and film evidence confirming it. Further north, there continues to be fighting in Volchansk. It's very difficult to get a clear picture of what is going on in Volchansk. But all the reports, the latest reports, appear to confirm that the Ukrainians are gradually evacuating their forces from northern Volchansk, that they're abandoning the area of the high-rise buildings and the other areas of northern Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, and that they're trying to concentrate their forces south of the Volcha River, where, again, most reports suggest that the Russians have crossed the Volcha River and have established bridgeheads in southern Volchansk, threatening the Ukrainian positions there. So, if the Russians are able to consolidate these gains, gain control of Volchansk, with the Russians now definitely on the move in Kharkiv region, the Ukrainian positions in Volchansk, in Kharkiv region are going to become increasingly difficult, and the Russians will be on the brink of reversing Ukrainian gains in Ukraine's Kharkiv offensive of 2022. That, by the way, would be a major psychological blow for the Ukrainians, because the Kharkiv 2022 offensive was the only significant victory that the Ukrainians have actually won over the course of this war. So, important events in Kharkiv region, in northern Donbass. There are many claims that the Russians are now starting to push north from Razdolovka in the Siversk area. They have recaptured close to Siversk the villages of Belogorovka and Sporny, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. The web around Siversk is tightening. The Russians have never captured Siversk at any point in this war. If they're able to capture Siversk, and they're able to cross the Zherebets River and take Liman, and they're also able to take Kupiansk, then, well, as I said, the Russian position will not only be restored to where it was ultimately before Ukraine's 2022 Kharkiv offensive, but will actually be stronger than it was then, because Siversk will be under Russian control, and of course the Russian army is much bigger and stronger now than it was then, and the Ukrainian army is much smaller and weaker now than it was then. Speaking of the size of the Russian army, the Russian Defense Ministry has repeated that Russia is recruiting 1,000 men a day. 1,000 men a day are enlisting in the Russian army, and that around 200,000 men have joined the Russian army this year. In fact, the Russian army is growing in size so much that there is some talk in Russia, I understand, of actually demobilizing some of the troops who have been fighting since the start of the war, because they can be replaced with well-trained, fresh troops, which something the Ukrainians are unable to do. They talked about doing it earlier this year, but as soon as General Syrskyi became Ukraine's overall military commander, he withdrew all proposals that Ukrainian troops fighting in the war, any Ukrainian troops fighting in the war, should be demobilized and allowed to return to civilian life. The Russians might be in a position before long where they might be able to do that. Something which, if the Russians are able to do it, will probably improve morale still further amongst the Russian soldiers. Well, all of this is all very interesting, what's going on in the north of the Donbass and in Kharkiv region, but the main battles continue to happen further south. The Russians continue to press around Chasiv Yar. The fact that we're getting less news from the Chasiv Yar area does not mean that there isn't a lot going on around Chasiv Yar. And I sense that actually there is. And I suspect that there is an awful lot more fighting in and around Chasiv Yar than we are being told. I remember how, during the Battle of Avdiivka, and by the way, the Battle of Torets, which we'll come to shortly, we suddenly got news that the Russians were far further advanced than any earlier reports had led us to think they would be. And I suspect that something similar is happening in Chasiv Yar. The Russians have a practice of holding back information about an important battle whilst it is underway, and the Ukrainians, if the situation is becoming very difficult for them in Chasiv Yar, probably also have their own reasons for holding information back. So I would not be surprised at all if at some point over the next 2 weeks, say, we suddenly discover that the Russians are occupying positions in Chasiv Yar where nobody expected them. Further south from Chasiv Yar, there is a mighty battle underway. I think that is the only way to describe it. A mighty battle going on in Toretsk. The Russians are launching massive bombing and missile strikes and artillery strikes all across the Ukrainian defenses in Toretsk. And the Ukrainians are being absolutely pounded there. The Ukrainians can rely on substantial fortifications that they created. They've been building in this area ever since the 2014 fighting. And in addition, Toretsk was very much a center of the Soviet coal mining industry. So there are all sorts of big coal mining facilities, landfills, industrial buildings connected with the coal mining industry, which form obvious and natural defenses that the Ukrainians can depend upon. But what has changed is that the Russian Air Force is now operating very intensively over Toretsk, and I suspect that this is having a dramatic effect on the Ukrainian defenses in Toretsk, and partly explains, alongside the lack of Ukrainian soldiers in Toretsk, why the Russians have been able to advance so much more quickly in the Toretsk area than anyone expected. Now, if one looks at the various maps which the various mapping projects have provided, one can see that the Russian forces are advancing in Toretsk around two pincers. There is an advancing force which is pushing northwards through an area of Toretsk called, I believe, Pivninye, and that's the northern pincer. And then there is a southern pincer which is driving southwards through New York, this village of New York, which, as I said, the Russians call Novgorodsky. Now, I call them pincers. They are, for the moment, sort of straight lines. They're not yet closing in around themselves. But I have noticed that there's been some speculation that they might eventually do that. And if there is a decision by the Russians to start closing in, well, they would not have encircled the whole of the Toretsk area, which is a large area, a very heavily built up area. But they would have encircled a large number of Ukrainian troops holding positions further along the front lines, who would then be surrounded if these two pincers were ever to meet. Now, the Russians have a history of creating cauldrons. This has never happened to anything like the extent that many expected during this war, including myself, by the way. Right at the very beginning of the war, I believe that the Russians were aiming to create a major cauldron around the Ukrainian forces in Donbass, but that never happened. And I've now come to understand that the geography and the scale of the territory and the complexity of the Ukrainian defenses and the size of the Ukrainian forces all made it impossible. But anyway, the Russians have never really established cauldrons in the classical sense on any big scale in this conflict. But it could be that they're now starting to work in the direction of doing so. I have previously said how these Russian moves through Chasiv Yar and north from Arkhangelskoye and Novoalexandrovka in the Ocheretino, Avdiivka area could potentially be used as two pincers to create a bigger cauldron around the Ukrainian forces. So it may be that that might be the plan. And it could be that this is also the plan for rather smaller units located in Toretsk. Well, we will see. All I will say is that the Russians are continuing to advance both of these two possible pincers are continuing to advance. We get film and photographic evidence from Toretsk now on a regular basis. And always and invariably, this shows the Russians further forward than the previous film and photographic evidence showed them to be. So that confirms that it is indeed the Russians who are advancing in the Toretsk area, and they seem to be advancing, as I've said already, irresistibly. It seems to be an unstoppable advance that is taking place in this area. We will see exactly what it is that the Russians plan. If there are double encirclements and things like that underway, well, that will reflect a dramatic change in the character of the war, and it will hasten, undoubtedly, the point of Ukrainian collapse. But anyway, we haven't reached anything quite like that point yet. Anyway, that's Toretsk. The most important and interesting battles continue to happen, in my opinion, in the Ocheretino, Avdiivka area. It's now confirmed that there's fighting going on in the village of Novoselivka Persha, which is located to the southwest of Ocheretino. This is apparently a major defense position that the Ukrainians established in this area. It looks as if the Russians have broken into this village, that the Ukrainians are not, that the Ukrainian troops, presumably from the 47th Mechanized Brigade, that are trying to hold their positions in this village, are in effect encircled. To be clear, we're probably talking about fewer than 100 men. But anyway, there is intense fighting going on. It looks as if Novoselivka Persha is about to fall. I've discussed how the Russians apparently control Sokol. There is a film which some think shows fighting still underway in the village to the west of Sokol called Yevgenivka. My own view is that this is an old film which shows fighting from a few days ago. I've heard that Yevgenivka is indeed now fully under Russian control. But one way or the other, the situation in Yevgenivka, Sokol, Novoselivka Persha, further north in Novoalexandrovka, and on the way towards the key village of Vozdvizhenka. In all of these places, the Russians appear to be advancing. And there is no sign that the Ukrainians can either withstand them or that they're in any position to fall back on any fortified positions where they can hold them. And I've noticed that over the last couple of days, the name of Vozdvizhenka, perhaps the most important village of all in terms of Russian objectives. The one that, if they capture, will lead to the cutting of the main supply road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar, further east. I've noticed that the name of the village of Vozdvizhenka is starting to turn up on Russian Defense Ministry summaries. They're talking about their forces being near Vozdvizhenka, which suggests that it is correct that the Russian forces are indeed creeping ever closer to this particular village. It's been pointed out by many people, the military summary channel has discussed this well, that the Russians seem to have complete fire control of all of the supply roads in this area, the ones that are used by the Ukrainians or would be used by the Ukrainians to keep their forces in these various villages, Sokol, Yevgenivka, Novoselivka, Persha, Vozdvizhenka, whatever, that the Russians seem to have complete fire control over these roads, and that Ukrainian units and supply convoys that try to use these roads are likely to face complete destruction by Russian artillery and drones. And, well, the military summary channel has discussed all this fairly well and fairly over a course of several programs. For me, actually, there have been some recent videos which I've seen which illustrate this quite well, though in a way that is different from some of the other films that films that other people refer to when making this particular point. It is absolutely correct that there is abundant evidence of large numbers of Ukrainian vehicles and equipment having been destroyed along these roads. But perhaps the single most interesting fact of all about these roads, if one looks at these films carefully, is that they are almost completely deserted. You do see occasional vehicles moving up and down them, presumably, well, in fact, always Ukrainian vehicles. But there is no sign of heavy traffic on these roads anymore. It's clearly become far too dangerous for the Ukrainians to use these roads on any sort of regular basis, either by day or by night. The villages are in effect cut off. The Russians have isolated each of them, and they're able to pick them off one by one because the Ukrainians cannot coordinate their forces between them or keep their forces in these villages supplied. And to repeat again, a point I've made now in several programs, with each village that is brought under Russian control, the Russians come closer to the point of cutting Ukraine's supply lines and also come closer to the point where they are able to start striking at Ukraine's key logistical bases, places like Kurakhovo, Selidovo, and Pokrovsk. They are already very close to Kurakhovo and Selidovo. If they capture Maximilianovka, a village where fighting is underway further south than here, than the places I've just been talking about, if they capture Maximilianovka, Kurakhovo is less than 10 kilometers away, so I understand. If they capture places like Novoselivka, Persha, and Karlovka, Selidovo is just a dozen or so kilometers away. And if they capture Progress, a village which the Russians are now in a position to attack from several directions, then, well, the distance from Pakrovsk is greater than that, but it is still within medium-range artillery range. So we can get a sense of the development of the battlefield. And it's been suggested that once Krasnogorovka falls, which it looks as if it is going to fall fairly soon now, suggested, as I said to my program yesterday, it seems the Ukrainians are now left controlling just a few buildings in the metropolitan area of Krasnogorovka, the Russians having taken an enormous amount of time to clear them from other places and to occupy other places which the Ukrainians deserted. But if Krasnogorovka falls, the Russians are in an even stronger position to move towards both Kurakovo and Selidovo, the main defense lines in this area that the Ukrainians created after 2014 will have once and for all and truly collapsed, and there is no real way that the Ukrainians can withstand these attacks further. Now, that's the summary of the situation on the battlefields. I want to just deal relatively briefly with a number of points that have been made by various commentators. Firstly, rather than talk about commentators, I am going to refer to a letter that was published in the Financial Times, but also in various other parts of the British media. I've mentioned this letter before in earlier programs. Amongst the signatories were people like Professor Mearsheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, Ian Proud, all people who I'm grateful to say have appeared on programs for the Duran. But I gather that the person who coordinated the drafting of this letter was Lord Robert Skidelsky, who is one of the most sane people looking at the situation in this conflict in Britain, and who is one of the few people who has been consistently advocating moves towards peace. And I'm going to just read briefly from this letter, which I think is something of a tour de force. But there is one point about it which I do want to make, which I think needs to be made, and which I won't say concerns me, but where I think it might be helpful if the record were set somewhat straight. Anyway, this is how the letter begins. Russia's latest military gains in the Donetsk region reinforce the case for a negotiated settlement of the war in Ukraine. The US and its allies support Ukraine's key war aim, which is a return to the 2014 borders, i.e. Russia's expulsion from Crimea and Donbass. But all informed analysts agree that short of a serious escalation of war, the likeliest outcome will be continued stalemate on the ground. And here I already have some concerns, because I don't think the situation is in any way in stalemate. What I have just described is not a stalemate. It is one of steady, incremental Russian advance and appalling Ukrainian losses. But anyway, they continue to refer to stalemate. And then they go on to say, with a not insignificant chance of a Russian victory. I would say that on the present trajectory, the course clearly points to a Russian victory. And as we've seen, one Russian general, Abdi Alaudinov, is even now floating the possibility that that victory might happen this year. But now, to continue, the conclusion points to the desirability even urgency of a negotiated peace, not least for the sake of Ukraine itself. Reluctance by the official West to accept a negotiated peace rests on the belief that anything short of a complete Ukrainian victory would allow Putin to get away with it. Now, I have nothing to fault with these comments, but this is the section, the one paragraph in this letter, which I do feel slightly queasy about. It says this, but this idea that, unless you achieve complete victory over Russia, that will appear to be a defeat in some way. But this ignores by far the most important outcome of the war so far, that Ukraine has fought for its independence and won it, as Finland did in 1939-40. Some territorial concessions would seem a small price to pay for the reality rather than the semblance of independence. My problem with this paragraph is that I think it is, frankly, not in accord with the historical facts. Let me first of all quickly say that about the Winter War of 1939-40, which the Soviet Union and Finland fought against each other. This article talks about Finland winning its independence in that war. I think that a fair summary of a very complex topic here is that there is continued controversy between historians as to the precise nature of Stalin's war aims in the 1939-40 Winter War, whether he was indeed aiming at the conquest of Finland or whether instead he was seeking important territorial concessions from the Finns in order to safeguard Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg. I'm not going to get into that debate in more detail. It seems to me that there are arguments on both sides in favor of the argument that Stalin was seeking some sort of conquest of Finland is the fact that prior to the start of the war and during the war, a government in exile made up of communists for Finland was set up in Moscow. But it's perhaps worth pointing out that in March 1940, the Soviet Union was in a position to defeat Finland comprehensively and conquer the country entirely, and it didn't do so. And the same possibility existed in 1944. And again, Stalin did not aim for an outright conquest and Sovietization of Finland at that time. Anyway, I'm not going to get into this because these are historical topics. I'm not going to pretend I am an authority of this particular history. I would say that there's something of a question mark as to whether it was indeed the case that Finland, which had been independent of Russia and the Soviet Union ever since the 1917 revolution, whether it really can be said to have fought and won its independence in the Winter War of 1939-40. But with respect to Ukraine, I think this whole premise is wrong. I know it's been put forward by various people. Anatol Lieven, who is another signatory of this letter, is one. But it seems to me that not only has Ukraine been independent of Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, but it has been antagonistic to Russia for most of that period. The Russians can in no sense be said to have had undue influence over Ukraine during that whole period. So talking about Ukraine fighting and winning its independence, or the reality of independence, as opposed to the semblance of it. Well, all that seems to me completely untrue if one looks to the past. And if one looks to the events of the existing war, well, the Russians, before the special military operation began, had been trying to get the Ukrainians to seek a negotiated settlement of their conflict in Donbass through the Minsk agreement, which we now know the Ukrainians never had any intention of complying with. And, well, when they started the special military operation in February 2022, they went out of their way repeatedly to say that they did not aim for the total conquest of Ukraine, and that they did not seek that conquest. And in fact, throughout February and March 2022, they negotiated with the Ukrainians, to all appearances in good faith, also with a view to settling the conflict, and in fact made clear their agreement to the draft agreement that was drawn up in Istanbul in March, April 2022. So I don't think it is correct to say that Ukraine has fought for its independence and won it in this conflict. I think this is being dangerously over generous to the Ukrainians. I think, on the contrary, by fighting this war, by refusing a negotiated settlement, first via the Minsk agreement and second via the Istanbul process, they are endangering their independence, which they had won back in 1991. And with every day that passes, with every week that passes, that point where Ukrainian independence might be brought into question draws closer. Already there are people in Moscow, in the Kremlin itself, who make little secret of the fact that they do see as the only acceptable outcome of this war the complete extinguishing of Ukrainian independence. One of them is very vocal about this. He writes and talks about this all the time. That is, of course, Dmitry Medvedev, who is the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council and Russia's former prime minister and former president. So I would put things in exactly the opposite way to the one that the authors of this article do. That this war is endangering Ukrainian independence. In no sense has Ukraine won it. Now, I understand why this letter is being phrased in this way. Doubtless it is being done to make the idea of negotiations more palatable for Western governments which have resisted them. But I think that there is a risk in doing this also, because there is a risk that instead of reaching a proper, satisfactory solution, which is going to go beyond entertaining certain concessions to the Russians, territorial concessions to the Russians, instead of accepting that that is perhaps what Ukraine has to do and accept neutral status and that kind of thing, the alternative is Ukraine ending up losing something which it already had, And we're going to have a story, a new narrative, a new utterly fictitious, mythological narrative of Ukraine winning an independence war, whereas in reality, by refusing negotiations, what it has actually done is devastated itself, lost far more territory than it needed to do, and perhaps put its entire existence into doubt. I think it's dangerous to create one myth to replace another. It's dangerous for Ukraine itself. It's dangerous for the West, which needs to start facing realities, not engaging in legends anymore, fabricating legends anymore. And this letter, which in all other respects I have complete support for and for what it says, this letter, in my opinion, risks undermining that by, as I said, creating a new legend to replace the old ones. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this letter. There's been an interesting series of articles in the national interest about the F16s that Ukraine is about to receive. There's been several articles which various people have been focusing on. The most useful and best, in my opinion, is one that was written actually last month on the 26th of June, which says that sending F-16 fighters to fight in Ukraine is just for show. It makes the point that these are completely obsolete weapons, aircraft, that they are not really capable of withstanding the far more powerful and now very experienced and well trained and piloted Russian Air Force. There's been a follow-up article which has just appeared a few days ago, or 2 days ago, which I think, which makes much the same point, but I don't think it does it as well as the earlier article that appeared on the 26th of June. I'm not going to read the article in detail, but suffice to say that both articles make the same point. The F-16 is now an old aircraft. The F-16s Ukraine is getting are themselves very old aircraft that have been refurbished and to some limited extent modernized. And they're not going to be available in anything like sufficient numbers to take on the Russian Air Force sufficiently. And there is another article in the national interest, this time by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. He sets out a possible way in which Ukraine might be able to hold the Russians back, though Daniel Davis acknowledges that doing so, that even if Ukraine does everything that he suggests, it would only, the best outcome would be a stalemate, and there is only a 50% chance at best that would happen. And again, it's all about going completely onto the defensive. And Daniel Davis suggests that in order to achieve that and to hold back the Russians and to inflict sufficient costs on them so as to get the Russians to agree to freeze the war on the existing contact line, Ukraine would need at least, it would need to mobilize an additional 300,000 troops and to train them. It would need 500,000 artillery shells, 7 more complete Patriot air defense systems. I understand there's 8 batteries per system. So we're looking at over 50 batteries of Patriot missiles, several hundred additional armoured vehicles of various types, and tens of thousands more drones. I'm going to say that I don't think that the capacity to supply Ukraine with weaponry on this scale, let alone the political will, exists. Ukraine might be able to mobilize 300,000 men, but we've recently been told that the figure of men that's going to be mobilized by Ukraine and brought into the army this year has now fallen to just 120,000. Perhaps Ukraine, with the collusion of West European governments, will be able to dragoon some of the Ukrainian men who fled to Europe to escape conscription, will dragoon them back to Ukraine, where they can be made unwilling conscripts in the Ukrainian army. I'm not saying that isn't going to happen, but it's certainly not something I would advocate for all kinds of reasons: moral, ethical, legal, and humanitarian. But anyway, as for the 500,000 artillery shells, I doubt they exist. Europe, as we have seen, can produce perhaps 500,000 shells this year, perhaps a few more, but it will need to replace some of the stocks of shells that it's used up supporting Ukraine. To do that, President Pavel's scheme to buy shells on the international market has failed, and US arms production, shell production, still falls far below these levels if US stocks, depleted US stocks, are also to be rebuilt. And, well, the 7 more Patriot air defense systems, that would be a massive commitment of Patriot missile systems to Ukraine. And, well, we've seen that the Russians have found ways to defeat the Patriot systems. And I think the only outcome of that would be more lost Patriot systems. And several hundred additional armoured vehicles. Where are they going to come from? Who is going to supply them? So I don't think this plan would work anyway, not based on what I'm seeing about the situation on the front lines. Daniel Davis himself seems to acknowledge the fact that Western governments are most unlikely to provide assistance on anything like this scale. If this is the scale of assistance that Ukraine needs to stabilize the front lines, I don't think it's going to happen. Daniel Davis makes an altogether different and far more sensible suggestion, which is that the Ukrainians immediately contact the Russians and say that they are prepared to engage in an immediate ceasefire along the existing line of contact and offer to begin negotiations immediately. The Russians have already made it clear that they will not agree to a ceasefire on that basis, but that they will agree to negotiations. Even if the Russians refuse the ceasefire, negotiations, it seems to me, as the Skidelsky letter correctly says, are now the overriding urgency if Ukraine is to survive. Let it happen. It must happen now, with the vacuum of leadership in Washington. And it must be said, the instincts of the president while he remains in office. I cannot see that anything like that will happen, at least until November, and most probably beyond, with the likelihood that the current crisis in the United States is only going to be resolved in January next year, and perhaps not even then. Well, this is where I end my program today. As I said, more from me soon, but not tomorrow. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Please remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget that you can also check out our shop. We still have the Football 24 series of products on sale. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Back again on Monday. Have a very good weekend. See you on Monday.